This guy's facing prison for cleaning a river after authorities ignored a polluted river for years. And this guy and a team of volunteers spent 10 days cleaning it all up themselves. So now he says the reward for restoring the river is a criminal investigation and the possibility of 2 years in prison. So I feel like to any sane person, you would go, okay, wait a minute, that's wrong. That sounds a little corrupt, because this whole story revolves around an environmental lawyer who spent 4 years trying to get anybody to do something about a polluted river near his home. And when I say polluted, I don't mean like, a few soda cans floating around. No, we're talking about a waterway that volunteers say had been clogged with silt, overran with invasive plants, and littered with everything from household appliances to needles. And when I found this story, I was honestly just so shocked. I had to cover it because this is just beyond insane to me. Like, you might have seen me from my coverage on the poop water situation that was happening in the Potomac River between Maryland, DC, and Virginia.
You have raw sewage.
And while in this situation, the river wasn't dealing with hundreds of millions of raw, untreated sewage being dumped into it daily, the case does rhyme. So in this case, we're talking about something that's happening in the UK. And according to campaigners, the wider river roading system has also struggled with years of sewage discharges and illegal dumping. And at the end of the day, people shouldn't be risking prison time for cleaning up their local river in a reasonable way. But I guess for most people, this would just be a sad thing they would complain about once on Facebook before, I guess, immediately moving on with their lives. But Paul here, his name is Powlesland. He is apparently not most people. So Paul here is a British barrister who specializes in environmental law. And apparently barristers are a type of lawyer in the UK. And Paul, he funded a group called Lawyers for Nature. He campaigns for something called Rights of Nature movement, which argues that rivers and ecosystems should have legal rights of their own.
The River Wye is really at the forefront of both river rights and river guardianship. And that's probably not a coincidence because we know the river is in real trouble. But what's amazing is it has one of the most vigorous grassroots guardianship movements with the Friends of the Wye doing amazing work to protect and restore the river.
To maintain its natural course and seasonal rhythms without obstructions or extractions.
Now this piece is really quite incredible. It's the first time that a river rights charter has been recognised by 6 different official bodies.
The council will reflect the intrinsic value of the River Wye and its tributaries within the new local plan.
Really the key part is what comes next. Is it just words, or are both the official bodies and the local guardians going to act to save the river? And I think they will.
He lives on a narrow boat on the river Roding, and in his Instagram bio, he literally describes himself as a river guardian, which honestly is like the most river guy thing I've ever heard. Like, rivers are basically his entire personality. So when Alders Brook, a section of the river Roding in East London, continued to get worse year after year, Paul says that he repeatedly reached out to authorities asking them to address the problem. And according to him, those requests went nowhere. Eventually, after years of this, he decided that if nobody else is going to clean the river, he should. And that decision is what turned a local volunteer cleanup into a story that's now making headlines around the world. So in February of 2026, Paul and a group of volunteers, they decided they were just done waiting. So over the course of the next 10 days, they would set out to restore a 250-meter stretch of Alders Brook. This was apparently serious work. The volunteers hauled out more than 200 bags of trash. They removed branches, weeds, invasive Japanese knotweed, and thick layers of silt that had been built up for over years. They also pulled out discarded household appliances, used needles, and even abandoned weapons. And at one point, the group even hired an excavator to help clear out the parts of the brook that had become heavily clogged. And according to Paul, the transformation was dramatic. Where there once was sludge that sat still, water was now flowing again. Native plants began actually reappearing, and Paul claimed fish returned to the parts of the brook for the first time in decades, along with dragonflies, herons, and even a nesting moorhen. So what nobody seems to be arguing here is the brook looked completely different afterwards. So for supporters, that was proof that a small group of dedicated volunteers had accomplished way more in 10 days than authorities managed to in years. Unfortunately for Paul though, that wasn't the only thing that happened after the cleanup was finished. Because within just days after, another group showed up at the river. And unlike the volunteers, they weren't there carrying trash bags. They were investigators, so the environmental agency didn't show up with a thank you card. No, they informed Paul that they were investigating the cleanup for possible violations of the environmental regulations, which is ironic that the taxpayer money is going to that rather than cleaning up the river itself. Like, this just feels like a parody. Like, why is this reality? Because again, remember who we're talking about here. Not some dude dumping waste into a river. No, Paul is an environmental lawyer who had just spent 10 days cleaning up the river. And according to a letter later reported by The Guardian, the agency believed unpermitted works may have taken place in a breach of the environmental permitting regulations. Excuse me, what? So officials raised concerns about dredging activity, which is material being moved onto the floodplain, and whether the work could create flood risks. Now, at first glance, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and the volunteers had just removed more than 200 bags of trash from a polluted brook. The river looked healthier, wildlife was reportedly returning. What's the problem? But yet, the people being investigated, no, they weren't the polluters, they were the cleanup crew. But this is where the story also gets a little more complicated, because the environmental agency, they weren't claiming that Paul hadn't done anything. Their argument was almost the opposite. They were saying that they had done quite a lot. And the issue was apparently the excavator, the silt removal, the physical change of the waterway. And I guess in other words, the agency's stance was basically, look, we're glad you care about the river, but you can't just show up and start modifying the river channel without permits and oversight. And honestly, I guess like whether you agree with them or not, you can at least understand why those rules exist. Because I mean, like if everyone showed up with a shovel and started messing with the river, things could get pretty weird pretty quickly. Because, you know, in theory, that could lead to a bunch of new homes suddenly being riverfront. Regardless, though, the problem for the environmental agency was that this wasn't happening in the pristine river full of thriving wildlife. This was a brook that, according to Paul and other local campaigners, had been neglected for years. And if the volunteers weren't supposed to fix the river, who was? So Paul, in the meantime, was not exactly in the mood to apologize. In fact, the more he talked about the investigation, the more it became clear that he saw it as proof of a much bigger problem. Because from his perspective, this wasn't really about permits, it was about priorities. So after news about the investigation became public, Paul accused the environmental agency of going after what he called an easy target. He argued that regulators had spent years failing to address the issues that had actually damaged the river, only to now suddenly become very interested in it after he cleaned up the mess. And this is where the sewage issue starts entering the story. So the wider river Roding has dealt with pollution problems for years. Friends of the Roding has claimed that one sewage outflow alone releases more than 750,000 liters of raw sewage into the river every single year. So yeah, you know, it does kind of rhyme with the DC, Maryland, Virginia situation with the Potomac River. Thankfully not as much, but this is not good whatsoever. But other groups have been raising concerns about illegal dumping and environmental degradation along parts of the waterways. So Paul's argument was essentially, you're investigating the people who remove trash while the river is still dealing with sewage and pollution. So wait a second, the dude who cleaned the river is under investigation, but the river still has sewage problems? Thankfully though, social media was quickly filled up with people praising the volunteers and criticizing the authorities. And people highlighted the risks volunteers took while pulling needles, debris, and who knows what else from that river. And as the story started spreading, the debate started growing way beyond just one brook in East London. Because suddenly, people weren't just arguing about Alders Brook, they were arguing about something way bigger. What exactly are citizens supposed to do when everyone agrees there's a problem, but fixing it yourself is suddenly illegal? Especially after authorities have ignored his continuous complaints for 4 years. Well, a few days ago, heavy rains swept across the area, putting the restored section of the brook to the test. So now, remember, one of the environmental agency's concern was actually a flood risk. So officials had questioned whether the work carried out by the volunteers could affect drainage and water management. So when the rain arrived, Paul saw an opportunity, because the morning after the storm, he posted photos of the brook and argued that the cleanup had actually done the opposite of what regulators were worried about. According to him, the restored section was now capable of holding hundreds of thousands of liters more water than before, because, you know, the years of accumulated silt is now removed. His argument was, instead of rainwater rushing straight into the river Roding and increasing flood pressure downstream, the brook was now acting more like a natural sponge. So water was now being temporarily stored, feeding nearby marshes, trees, and wildlife before gradually being released. In other words, Paul wasn't just saying, look how nice the river looks now. He's kind of saying, look, the thing you might say caused problems just helped during a major rainstorm. Now, obviously, like, one storm doesn't magically settle a technical dispute about flood management. Like, there has to be some dude out there with 3 engineering degrees preparing a 400-page report explaining why things are a little bit more complicated than that. But I mean, from a public relations perspective, this was a solid moment, because while all the lawyers and regulators were arguing about the permits, most people were looking at the photographs and going, well, the river looks a whole lot better and it seems to be working, so what's the issue here? Because if Paul simply ignored the river, none of this would be happening. If he just walked past the trash every day and the sewage issues and the invasive plants and decided, well, it's not my problem, I just have to live in this environment, there would be no investigation and there would be no debate. Instead, he cared enough to do something. And I guess the question now is whether the law sees that as a solution or a problem, because he's currently being accused of carrying out work that allegedly requires permits. And whether you think that's reasonable or ridiculous probably depends on how much faith you have in the system that was supposed to, I guess, protect the river in the first place, because this is where the entire story starts to feel kind of like a loop, because Paul says he spent 4 years asking officials for help. Officials didn't act or didn't act in the way he found right. So volunteers then stepped in and cleaned up the river. Then the officials who allegedly didn't fix the problem, they showed up to investigate the people who did fix the problem. Okay, so now they care? It's kind of like the sort of thing that sounds like a joke until you realize everyone involved is just being completely serious. So the environmental agency is serious when it says permits exist for a reason. And Paul is serious when he says local communities shouldn't be punished for restoring waterways. But I think the funny part here is if you guessed which side is currently being represented by an environmental lawyer, they would probably get it wrong, because the environmental lawyer is the guy arguing that environmental regulators are being too focused on the paperwork. Meanwhile, the environmental regulators are explaining why environmental rules matter. That sounds like a whole lot of bureaucratic bloat to me. But hey, I guess everyone involved believes they're protecting nature. They're just disagreeing on how. So Paul probably thought the hardest part would be cleaning the river. Turns out that might have been the easy part, which brings us to where things stand today. So at the moment, the environmental agency is investigating whether the cleanup violated environmental regulations. No charges have currently been filed, no court date has been set, and no decision has been made for whether prosecutors will move forward with this case. That said though, the potential consequences are serious. The alleged offense can carry penalties of up to 2 years in prison, unlimited fines, or both. And for Paul, there's an additional issue. He's not just a volunteer or an activist, he's a practicing barrister. So any criminal conviction would potentially have professional consequences as well. So I guess we kind of just have to wait and see what regulators decide. Maybe the investigation goes nowhere. Maybe it turns into some weird legal battle, or maybe both sides eventually sit down and figure out how community groups and environmental agencies can actually work together instead of fighting each other. Who knows? But that's the story of Paul Powlesland, the environmental lawyer, river guardian, and boat-dwelling activist who spent years of his life trying to save a river, finally did something about it, and somehow he ended up under criminal investigation for his trouble, facing up to 2 years in prison with unlimited fines. Yeah, this is just so crazy, I had to cover it. So hey, if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. Also, where'd it go? Where'd the thing go? I have a cup somewhere. There it is. Also, real quick, last chance to get this beautiful Atozy cup over at gamersubs.gg/Atozy for 10% off the cup. You can pre-order it now, and you also get 10% off the whole store with code Atozy. Regardless, this cup is gone forever on the 26th, which is tomorrow. So pre-order one while you can, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys for the support. Peace.